recorded. Perfect. All right. So More Than 250 is funded by the Arts and Science Council through their Culture Blocks grant program. Please just make sure to keep your microphones muted during the program. And if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat and I will be asking them throughout. Today we are joined with Dr. Evan Nooe, who is an assistant professor of history and historian for the Native American Study Center at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. Kassidy Plyler, who's the cultural public program specialist at the Catawba Cultural Center, and then Nolan Dahm, who is our very fantastic exhibits and interpretation manager at the museum. Nolan is gonna kind of kick us off with some slides about America 250, the revolution, why we are having this chat, and just thanks again for joining us.
All right, everybody. So one sec, I'm just admitting a few more people here, and then I'm going to share my screen. We're going to share this. All right, and everybody can see this? Yes? Awesome. So we call this program More Than 250, and we have this, lovely museum building that you can see there that we would all be sitting in if we didn't have a snowmageddon over the weekend. But More Than 250 is the name of this program because we wanted to reference something called America 250, and I'll talk to you about that in just a second. But really, it's called More Than 250 because the 250 number there is about something called the semi-quincentennial. And what that is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the birth of America. They had big celebrations on the 200th anniversary, they had big celebrations on the 100th anniversary, and everybody wants big celebrations on the 250th as well. And this year, we start those celebrations. And so we wanted to take a step back and think about where do we stand on this, literally and figuratively, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So whenever I talk about history, whenever I give any presentations about history here in Charlotte, I always start with this map right here. This map that you're looking at is very roughly some paths, trading paths that existed in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. These are based on lots of different sources, and as I said, they're pretty approximate, but I highlighted part that I want you to look at there. It is labeled on this map as the Okanichi Path, but it has had lots of different names throughout history, and it has some names that you might recognize in a second. But as you can see, it's basically filtering a lot of stuff from New England and down all the way almost into Georgia, up and down the Mid-Atlantic, trading routes that have existed for hundreds, if thousands, and probably in some cases almost 10,000 years, right? People have been living along this path. And so I'm going to show you another map here, though. This map is a pretty famous map as well. It's sometimes known as the Catawba Deerskin map, and this is an English explorer, settler. He visited the Catawba people, and they had a map on deerskin, and this is his copy of it. And this was in right around 1700. I can't remember the exact year. But as you can see here, this is how the Catawba people depicted their world. This is sort of trading networks rather than harsh borders. You can see on the left there is Charleston. So on this map, it's actually flipped upside down. In our eyes, right north for us is down on this map. And then you can see Virginia is the other boxy thing in the bottom right there. But the rest, all of those indigenous communities trading with the Catawba in the middle right there, that is how the world was perceived before settlement. But obviously, European settlers arrive, and that's kind of the story that a lot of people are talking about during the 250th. So this right here is the red line on there is the Great Wagon Road. And that is the road that the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, those settlers of Mecklenburg County, that is how they got down to Charlotte. They came from up in Northern Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania area, and they traveled down this route, some of them into Tennessee, but a lot of them down into Mecklenburg County and continuing down south. And you can see there that highlighted route that they took, that's the same route. That's that same trading route that had existed for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, right? They're taking that same route that was once an animal migration path that became a human trading route that is now a massive highway for European settlers to come down into Charlotte. And my last map here for y'all to tie it in together is what it looks like today. That's I-85 and then I-40 and I-85, right? So when we talk about, for example, you might hear a lot of land acknowledgments happen before a lot of presentations. When we talk about that stuff, it's not just sort of figurative stuff or stuff that happened way in the past. These are decisions that accumulate and affect literally how we get from place to place in the modern day. Decisions that were made thousands and thousands of years ago. And so that is where we stand, literally, right? That is the geography of where all of this is taking place. And that brings us to America 250. So that this now is the moment where we are 250 years from the founding of the United States, in quotes. And for us at the museum, that starts in May, this May, of 2025 is 250 years since that document on the left was written, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And we don't have time today to get into sort of all of the nitty-gritty of did that document exist or not. But what is true is that Mecklenburg County was one of the earliest groups of people, the folks of Mecklenburg County was one of the earliest groups of people to write down that they wanted to be free from Britain. We have a house of one of those people on our campus at the museum, and that little diorama in the background there is what the context of what we're talking about today. That is what the uptown Charlotte looked like 250 years ago. So I just kind of want to set the scene for everybody before we start this conversation of how do we think about the revolution? What was the Catawba's role in all of this? Is the 250th even a useful thing for us anymore? We'll get into all of that today, but I just wanted to kind of have us all have this baseline of why we're talking about the 250th. And so we'll stop there, right? America 250. It's really being led for us by a group called the American Association for State and Local History. They've tried to introduce these themes here on the left, right? Recognizing these unfinished revolutions, American experiments, right? They're emphasizing the fact that the 250th story can be a broad one that incorporates a lot of these conversations. So thank you again to Evan and Kassidy for being here. And I think we will just start with some introductions and we can move on from there. So thanks y'all for coming to this talk, and I'm excited to get into this panel discussion. And I will stop sharing.
Do you want to introduce yourself first, Nolan? Get the ball rolling.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Nolan. I'm our exhibits manager at the museum. I'm a historian who's been here for just about 3 years now. I'm not from Charlotte, but I love it here, and I'm really excited to learn in my job. And I'm going to be making that exhibit about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence for May. So this is really important for me. How about you, Evan?
Certainly. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to be a part of the panel. I'm sorry we couldn't all meet in person, but probably better safe than sorry with what was supposed to be a pretty bad snowstorm. But yeah, my name's Evan Nooe. I'm an assistant professor of history. I'm the historian for the Native American Studies Center at University of South Carolina, Lancaster. So in that role, I'm primarily a professor first. I teach U.S. history. I have a background in Native American history and Native American studies, and I look at themes of settler colonialism, violence, and how events of these intersections of indigenous and settler people are memorialized as well. So something like how we look at the American Revolution and sort of our remembered past is in line with what I do.
And Cassidy?
Hi, I'm Cassidy Plyler. I am the cultural public program specialist. Big long term for I coordinate and facilitate public programming for the Catawba Cultural Center. I'm also first and foremost a Catawba citizen. A lot of my knowledge has been obtained from just being culturally immersed from a very young age. So I take a lot of pride in our history. I have been doing tons of research to kind of find the truth of things. And growing up on the reservation, it gives you a different perspective, per se, than just coming from the outside looking into it. So I'm honored to be here to represent Catawba Nation, the Cultural Center, and looking forward to this discussion.
So, Cassidy, I would love to start with you because I think when we talk about remembering the revolution, I mean, if you just, I go to the Catawba Nation's history page on y'all on the nation's website, and it there's a big part about the Catawba's role in the revolution. And from my perspective, it seems like the Catawba, the revolutionary period is a bit of like a point of pride, maybe for the Catawba people. So I'd just love to hear your perspective to start us off. How is this period remembered? As a citizen, what does the revolutionary period mean to you? And what sort of place does it, what place does it have in the Catawba histories?
Well, um, first off, we have just actually unveiled a monument, and it's the first monument to memorialize the Catawba who served in the American Revolution. Because the Catawba were the first and one of the only tribes that fought the entirety of the American Revolution alongside the colonists and settlers here. And so we as Catawba, like for me, my great 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 grandfather, John Brown, he served in the battalion of Catawba that were in the American Revolution. So the war history is just there, that sense of pride, a sense of warriors, because that's something they did all along. But growing up, it's nice to see there is more acknowledgement and recognition, and especially with the 250th that has been coming around. I actually sit on the York County Executive Committee for the SC 250, and also have been involved with the SC 250 in every county in South Carolina. So we're actually kind of correcting information that's out there, making sure the Catawba are depicted correctly. But we served a huge role in the American Revolution. There was a group of Catawba that just served. It was about 45 members of this group that was strictly Catawba. But then there was also another battalion that was a mixed group. And there was Catawba, there were other natives and slaves, and also backcountry people. And that group there played a key role in Charleston in protecting it from the British from seizing one of the forts there. So we were very crucial, and also we acknowledge the women that are also very often overshadowed in the American Revolution and in general throughout history. But the Catawba women would supply food and shelter and help with organizing and feeding and supporting troops in the area as well. So we played a huge role in not just fighting alongside, but also helping nurture and protect those alongside us too.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess I didn't realize that the Catawba were one of the only groups that fought throughout the whole revolution. That's a really interesting that to me is just really interesting. Evan, is there anything that you want to add just about the sort of context here about how the revolution sort of has been remembered and how we should sort of think about all this stuff before we get into the details?
Certainly, yeah, I can maybe give some big picture framework here. I think the work that people like Kassidy and the Catawba Nation are doing is really instrumental in helping us reframe a little bit how we remember and hopefully, even teach the American Revolution in our classrooms. So much about what we talk about in terms of how the American Revolution plays out is that, supposedly all of the indigenous peoples in the, Eastern North America primarily sided with the British. And that's not necessarily the case in every instance. We can see groups like the Catawba are going to ally with the American colonists. They're going to fight alongside. They're going to have sort of common cause and at times aligned interests to work together to advance not necessarily the same outcome, but sort of mutually beneficial outcomes that they hope will be on the other end of this war. Um, Oftentimes, and things that I have researched in looking at how Indigenous people in the American Revolution are remembered are from sort of the settler perspective, from the colonial perspective, from the descendants of those colonists after the United States is formed as a nation. And it is one that is often colored by violence, trying to basically portray American settlers, usually sort of in what was considered the backcountry, as being victims of indigenous violence at the start of the American Revolution. And one of the tropes that often gets intertwined in this sort of role of indigenous people in the American Revolution is that they're supposedly being manipulated by the British. That we see both American colonists at the time of the American Revolution and then their descendants and the communities that are remembering these events point back to saying that, well, you know, we supposedly had good relations with the Native Americans until the British interceded and rallied them to the cause to fight against the American colonists. And that is a bit of a misattribution of the circumstances. We can see time and time again that Indigenous people have their own motivations, have their own causes to trying to stop the expansion of American settlers into Indigenous territory, into Indigenous nations, and that this sort of pervasive sort of myth of the British instigators is one that's often influenced how we remember the American Revolution and how we remember Indigenous people sort of navigating the American Revolution.
You know, just to sort of bring a local flavor to that, that is part of the backstory of Hezekiah Alexander himself, the guy who owned the plantation that the museum is on. There's a story from when he met his wife, Mary Alexander. Or well, her name was not Alexander at the time, Mary Sample. They were up in Pennsylvania for just like a few months, maybe a year or two, and they got attacked by savages, and then that's sort of what instigated them to flee down to North Carolina, where they sort of, you know, the sort of story has been told as, you know, then they sort of become the revolutionary rebel leaders of the South. And so that is definitely something that I think I notice with a lot of the ways that our home site at the museum has been talked about in the past as well. Um, so, you know, not diving into some of those specifics, can you say a little bit more about like what specific roles were indigenous nations playing during the American Revolution? You know, on a broader scale, but particularly during the Southern campaign time that we're going to be talking about with the 250th here in North Carolina.
I also just kind of wanted to add in as well to kind of piggyback on what he was saying about the Native perspective being swayed. And, you know, honestly, this is one of the first times that Native people have actually had a voice in how we're represented because, unfortunately, often history is written about us, not by us. And so for us to have a voice in this is very beneficial. But like he said, you know, there was that convincing of the British for surrounding troops, of surrounding tribes to convince them to ally with the British. But one of the major things that I have learned and have been taught is the Catawba paired alongside with the colonists because of the treaties. We signed treaties, and a lot of people who were originally signing this treaty alongside the Catawbas switched and were going to revolt against the British. So, in order to try to preserve those treaties and preserve what we had all left, we allied with the people that we thought would help honor those the most. And I believe that kind of it led from there. You know, we even have things where Catawbas have been honored for their service, but it is often, like you said, overshadowed because of this perspective of native savages.
So, Evan, the Catawba were here, and I think you mentioned earlier that a lot of people sort of already know the story of the Cherokees' role in the Revolution. That's kind of the one that maybe gets talked about a lot here. I guess two parts to the question. Maybe why is that one story sort of has become the dominant narrative, and then kind of what actually happened, I guess, would be the second part of that question.
So I'll try to condense this down to make it digestible since I don't want to monopolize all the time. But we see actually some of the interesting circumstances of the American Revolution at the start of the American Revolution, especially as it pertains to South Carolina and then, of course, its bordering colonies with Georgia and North Carolina. We see actually at the beginning of the American Revolution in the American South that it isn't necessarily a war against the British first. It is a war against the Cherokee. We see in what becomes the upstate South Carolina. We see in the summer of 1776 that the Cherokee are certainly intertwined with the international going-ons of sort of the developing crisis between the American colonies and the British Empire. And they see an opportunity to address grievances that they have against these colonists that are increasingly encroaching onto their land, that are enacting violence against Cherokee people. So we see in the summer of 1776 that the Cherokee are going to launch an offensive to basically try and push colonists off of indigenous borders in the South Carolina upstate. And this initial attack this initial sort of campaign is successful, but it is one that is going to rally the cause of Carolina colonists, North Carolinians, and South Carolinian colonists as well. And part of the way that this war plays out against the Cherokee and the Southern colonists at first is one that often sort of gets absorbed into this sort of retelling of the American Revolution, that many of the Carolina militia that participate in this reprisal attack against the Cherokee then go on to be influential South Carolinians in the American Revolution. They become patriots and sort of leaders of the early American nation. But what ends up happening in the aftermath of this conflict between the Cherokee and the Carolinians that becomes disastrous for the Cherokee, that is a brutal campaign against the Cherokee, is that it becomes remembered by the settlers involved, and then the state of South Carolina, and to a degree, even sort of taught in public education throughout the 20th century as one of these instances in which the Cherokee have basically made this surprise attack against innocent settlers in the upcountry or in the upstate. And it was sort of a treacherous sneak attack against people that they had considered friends. We see in one area in particular, an area where basically Greer, South Carolina is now in the Tiger River Valley, where a very influential family in South Carolina history is involved in the start of the Cherokee War here, and that are the Hamptons. So Anthony Hampton, he's going to have a son named Wade Hampton. He's going to have a son named Wade Hampton II, and then anybody who's aware of South Carolina history in the 19th century, Wade Hampton III is going to be a pretty big figure in both Civil War history and Reconstruction era politics for the state of South Carolina. And this family is going to perpetuate sort of the story about what happens to them. And it's going to take a very sort of selective approach in remembering the circumstances of their experience. They're going to do things like leave out the fact that they are settling on land that was agreed to be vacant between the South Carolina colony and the Cherokee when they settle in the Tiger River Valley. They are going to leave out the fact that they are going to be involved in some pretty horrendous reprisals against the Cherokee, in which they're burning towns. In some instances, even potentially, the colonists are killing captured Cherokee Indians after they've surrendered. And they're going to be destroying food stores to basically purge these people from the land. But what gets passed down over generations of the Hampton family is that attack by the Cherokee against their homestead, one that they claim is a surprise attack, one that was done by friends, one that is described in memory as particularly brutal. There's going to be descriptions about how Hampton family members are going to be shot, how Hampton family members are going to be tomahawked. There's going to be sort of the memorialization of an unnamed infant that's killed in this raid as well. And those things certainly happened, and those things were certainly brutal, but the way that they become sort of selectively memorialized and tied to the American Revolution, tied to the experience of settlers' relationships to indigenous people in South Carolina, really influences sort of this portrayal of Native peoples for for at least a century, if not still today.
So I like what you said there at the end. The phrase you used was selectively memorialized acts. And I think that is something that's a term I think I'm going to start using now because I think it really gets at how history and the histories that we tell ourselves, the history with a capital H that we have told about Charlotte, I think in a lot of ways has fallen into some of those traps. And I'm excited that we are using this America 250 opportunity to really make sure that if we are going to do a memorial about 250, we're really going to sort of tell the whole story. So, um, you know, Kassidy, I want to come to you next. I wonder if you have anything to add there, or I also want to talk a little bit about kind of what happens next.
Um, really just touching on what he says there is, that relationship was tarnished, and there was a lot of destruction and forced policies on against the Cherokee after this. And with the Catawba, I think our main thing was to try to stay out of the way. At one point, we had Nooe, often referred as King Hagler. He would negotiate, and he told us as a people that we were not the majority anymore. We are not going to be the majority in the United States. And this was in the early 1700s. He knew that. And so you want to ally with the ones that are going to still be here. In order to kind of preserve ourselves, we ally with those that we think we can preserve alongside. Um, it was beneficial yet detrimental at the same time, because much of our history has been construed because often we didn't write things down. Oral history was the tradition within our nation, along with many other tribes. And so when things aren't written down, we go on perspectives of those from outside. um, it's kind of hard to convince people that, well, this is the real story of how it was, when there's so much history out there written, like you said, in quotes, history written that has been taught through for hundreds of years now, that it's just now we're trying to fix it. And it's really hard, from an indigenous perspective, to change the minds and kind of convince people that there are injustices that we can correct just by making little things accurate. For example, there's a park at the inlet breach in Charleston around Sullivan's Island. And there's a sign there, and the sign depicts the Catawba. It says the Catawba, and the drawing of the Catawba is not accurate at all. So I've approached the park and trying to correct the sign, but they're asking for proof that why this is offensive or why this is wrong. And I'm just like, well, it's our community. It's wrong because we say it's wrong. It's not right. If you're going to depict someone, do it accurately. And so that's what I'm really grateful for. And like what you said, next steps is to kind of be proactive in correcting these, little things that can be changed with not so much work. Um, for like this sign, one of the things is there's a tattoo in the wrong place. It's something, yes, the tattoo would have been the same. It's a snake, a black snake tattoo. Catawba had black snake tattoos, but the location of the tattoo is not accurate. And so it's something little, you can literally just paint the little snake away and just fix it. But, when you're asking the people who are being represented for proof of why it's wrong, it's kind of it's like a double-edged sword. What do we do at that point? And that's when we come to committees like this and organizations and groups where we can voice that and hope that we can as a whole kind of correct these wrongs, not just for Catawba, not just for indigenous people, but even the African American communities that played a huge role in the American Revolution as well.
So something else that America 250, sort of the leaders, I guess, have asked us to focus on is, and I think it's important, is the fact that there are 250 years of history there, right? It's not just the revolution happened and now here we are today. And I think, especially with histories of the Catawba people and of indigenous people, I think that's sometimes the way we think about it. We think there were indigenous people here, and then the settlers came, and the revolution happened, and now the white people are here, and the sort of indigenous history ends, right? And so to kind of kick off the second half here, I wonder if Evan or Kassidy can you fill us in on, what are some of the key things that we should know about what has happened since the revolution? I'll admit that's a gap in my knowledge. I know that's a huge question, but I just wonder if you can just talk about kind of what's happened since this revolutionary time that I think we focus on a lot.
I'm happy to let Cassidy speak to the experience of Catawba or wider first, and then I can certainly add on in terms of what it's been like trying to sort of teach these sorts of questions.
Um, so for the Catawba, we were actually they were honored. They went to honor the Catawba that served in the Revolution. They were awarded gorgets, um, one of which we actually have on display at the Cultural Center, which is pretty interesting. And it was from a man named Pine Tree George. And on the plaque that the government gave him to give him honor, it says Finey, Finey, because they shortened it to Piney. He asked to be named Pine Tree on his award, but they said it wasn't a real name, so they wouldn't put it. And there was a lot of controversy there, and we were honored. But there was also other Catawba that eventually were stifled. It took a long time to be stifled. Peter Harris, he was one of the first to be stifled for his honor. He got one check and then he died the next month. So and it's throughout time we just don't talk about the honors that these Native people have gotten. And for me, I've always grown up. My great great grandfather fought in the Revolution. His son or grandson fought in the Confederate Army, and it was always just kind of fighting alongside people in order to stay. And we know things were changing, and since the Revolution, yeah, there was a time period where they didn't hear much from the Catawba. They just wanted to be left alone. After that, we tried to stay in our boundaries on the land, but after there was more and more encroachment. And we tried to reach out to our George Washington that we served alongside, fought alongside. And we even sent some Catawba up to his home in Mount Vernon and incommoded him or inconvenienced him for several days by squatting on his lawn there, just trying to get answers on to what can we do to honor these treaties and protect our land. And after a long time, and eventually there was no response. The only thing that really came out of that was George Washington writing about it in his diary, and then also writing a letter to the U.S. Secretary of War. After that, more and more and more people were coming into the land that was Catawba. And then eventually we went into this treaty with South Carolina. That was an illegal treaty at the time. And the rest of our land that we had fought alongside these people to try to protect was then again taken. And so a lot for the Catawba was more, and indigenous is, it was a lot of loss after, and expecting promises to be honored because of our efforts and the things that we did to fight alongside the people that settled here, and then not have things honored. And things have been breaking since the beginning of um, our first agreement, our first treaty of Pine Tree Hill, later into the Treaty of Augusta, and then we had the Treaty of Nations Ford. But all through the same thing, these treaties were always broken. Treaties have always been broken with our people and other indigenous people. Up until, even the 1990s, we were still fighting for that. Um, so I think our biggest thing is the acknowledgement, fighting for acknowledgement that we are still here. And with history, it's like I said before, it's written often by people who are not from that community that they are teaching about. In history books, often there's not much talked about Native people on the East Coast after, the Revolution, after the Trail of Tears. They were like, oh, well, what happened? And there's so many people who do not know we exist still. And I think this is that time to shine, show that we are still here and things have changed a lot for us, but we still have this strong honor and pride of what we did to help the people that did survive and were able to thrive and become what is America today.
Yeah, I'll add that, Cassidy's spot on with sort of these trends in sort of the American consciousness about this idea that indigenous people aren't still here. Um, you can sort of see in maybe sort of the worst models of how to teach American history is that there are indigenous people here when the colonists arrive, and they're maybe talked about in that first lesson, and then they might come up again when you teach the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, and then they're sort of never mentioned again. And that was a pretty common model for how to teach U.S. history for a long time. I can say that it is one that is changing, that I can say that probably at least for a generation now, that has not been the case. We really see in the 1970s, alongside indigenous activist movements, pushing reminders about a continued indigenous presence throughout North America. And this has trickled its way into how we teach U.S. history and how we sort of address sort of this broader consciousness of American peoples in the United States. Um, we see this, story of supposedly disappearing people be a theme in not just how American history is taught, but how Indigenous people have been conceived of for a couple hundred years at least. That there is this idea that certainly there is land loss, that there are the elimination of certain Indigenous ethnic groups, absolutely. But Indigenous people are going to adapt, they're going to respond, and they are going to navigate sort of the circumstances just like everybody else. We certainly see setbacks for Indigenous people. The American Revolution is an opportunity to reconsider how colonists and Indigenous people are going to relate to one another, but it certainly doesn't play out very prosperously for Indigenous people in the United States. But that does not mean they're going to be erased or eliminated. They're still going to be there. We even see this in the 1830s and 1840s when the United States is conducting sort of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing campaigns of Eastern North America to try to remove as many Indigenous people from east of the Mississippi to a federally managed territory west of the Mississippi in what becomes modern-day Oklahoma. But groups like the Catawba are going to find ways to navigate sort of their permanence in the places that they have called their homelands for time immemorial. We're going to see groups like the Cherokee, who are sort of famously associated with the Trail of Tears, find a way to relocate to Western North Carolina and create the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians that is still here today. They're going to famously try and navigate sort of the Supreme Court system, get rulings in their favor But two branches of the federal government are not going to follow through on that Supreme Court ruling. So we'll see certainly thousands of Cherokee die, thousands of Cherokee be relocated, but there will be a band of Cherokee that stay in Western North Carolina and create sort of the foundations of that modern indigenous nation that are with us today. We see conversely experiences in Florida, where the Florida Indians are going to go to war against the United States, against the settlers who are encroaching their territory, against the U.S. military who are trying to purge them from the Florida Peninsula. And this is going to be one of the most grueling wars in U.S. history. The Second Seminole War is going to take place from 1835 to 1842. It's going to require upwards of 40,000 troops to try and remove and expel the remaining Florida Indians in the peninsula. And to put that into perspective, we see about 40,000 soldiers fighting for independence in the American Revolution. So we see about two generations later, the same manpower commitment being utilized to try and purge indigenous peoples from a territory that's basically purchased under duress from Spain in the Florida Peninsula. But the Seminole will sustain. They will create basically camps in southern Florida, in the Everglades, and create the beginnings of what becomes the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And there's also the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida that are going to remain in these places despite immense pressure to expel them from their homelands. And we can see the Catawba, the Cherokee, and the Seminole are different examples of this story in which indigenous people are going to try to remain where they have always been and navigate sort of the hostility of an expanding United States, expanding states themselves as they try and displace Native people.
So just another interesting fact I didn't know. I want to clarify. Did you say there were 40,000 troops taken to expel some like indigenous communities from Florida, and that's the same number that fought in the Revolution? Is that what you said?
Yes, approximately. So yeah, we're going to have about 40,000 patriots fighting for independence in the American Revolution, and then we have beginning in 1835 from 1842 about 40,000 troops that are going to be deployed over the course of that war to try and expel the Florida Indians from what is that time the territory of Florida. And this is going to be comprised of thousands of militia that are going to basically volunteer for service, that are going to decide to leave their own homes and travel to Florida under their own free will to engage in this expulsion campaign. Gradually, the federal military will sort of take more control over how this war is fought later on in the conflict. But we see in the first couple of years of the war, South Carolina is going to send 2,000 volunteers between 1835 and 1839 to Florida with the extent pretend of what they are presenting themselves as sort of defending the Florida settlers. But what in effect they are doing is conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Florida Indians in their homelands.
Thank you. So I want to ask one concluding question, and then we'll get to questions from the audience here. So here we are. It's the 250th. We got to talk about it. And there's going to be a lot of people talking about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. There's going to be a lot of people talking about the Declaration of Independence, sort of the Southern campaign here in Charlotte. Um, my question to both of you is, um, how should we think about that? How should we think about the 250th? We're going to do a lot about it at the museum. And I am sort of personally curious, how do you think we should think about the 250th that's really going to be going on for the next 5 years down here in the South?
I think my biggest thing is to express the fact that we need to tell the whole story, the accurate whole story. And the way to do that is what you did today, including the people that you're talking about, possibly even someone with the Eastern Band. I know things are different with how they negotiate with people outside of their community. But I do think it's a time for voices of people who haven't really had a voice to be heard. Um, in South Carolina, here in York County, we have historic plantations where there's actually descendants from the slave plantations in Brattonsville that sit alongside this to, talk about the efforts of the African American community during the Revolution, because we're not just the only minority here. That's my biggest thing, is to always just make sure that the whole story is being told, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
I'd certainly like to echo that sentiment. When we talk about the American Revolution, when we remember the American Revolution, especially at times of anniversaries, it's certainly valuable to reflect on the possibilities, the opportunities, the positivity that comes out of these events. But in the same way that the American Revolution, in a lot of ways, was also a civil war, loyalists who retained sort of their affiliation with the British Empire are going to be fighting neighbors who are now engaged in the American Revolution. And this is often sort of how we sort of remember the American Revolution, often sort of streamlined in this story of a Declaration of Independence, of George Washington winning a war, and eventually getting the US Constitution. But we can see that if you take more of a perspective based on the places in which these events happen, it offers an opportunity for more perspectives, more points of view, addressing more experiences and how the American Revolution impacts a wider swath of people. And it is absolutely essential to account for those different experiences, those different perspectives, and certainly looking to historians to try and be a little bit more flexible in how they address the gaps of these perspectives. We are traditionally trained to look at the evidentiary record and sort of written documentation, but that does not encapsulate the experiences of all of the people that are inhabiting these places and involved in these events. We have seen some transformations in utilizing sort of an interdisciplinary approach, looking at ethnographies, anthropology, archaeology, indigenous oral traditions as well, as a way to address these shortcomings. And it is one that I'd certainly encourage going forward as we look at how we reflect on the American Revolution, how we reflect on this era, and both sort of its causes, conduct, and consequences.
So yeah, I think that's a great spot to end on. Thank you both for your time. We've got 10 minutes now for some questions from the audience. You can pop them in the chat that I think Kendall is monitoring there. If you want to like pop your little raise your hand, I think we could also do that too if you want to speak your question. But yeah, we'll hand it over to the audience here and go from there. Maureen, go for it.
Okay, I think that's has unmuted me. But I really appreciate this conversation. I just wanted to add, when you talk about how do we present the 250, I just finished reading This Fierce People, and I can't, it really opened my eyes to what actually occurred in the South and how it was so different from what we heard about the battles in the North. And yet it was very important, the battles that did occur, and how it was such a mix of people, and really, I'm going to say, kind of a ragtag collection of soldiers to be able to fight the battles in the South, because they didn't have the the armies, the coordination that was actually occurring in the North, and there was very little ability to or cooperation to be able to send volunteers to the South. And just overall, how the conditions are very different. The really the geography but I also really can appreciate the combination of how we did have some slaves, although they were not allowed to really participate in a battle because they didn't want them to really have to be armed, and also the indigenous people of how they were divided. It's just, I also getting back to even further into the Paris Treaty of what the British did with giving away Indian land in the Ohio Valley and made it a gift to the colonies that wasn't theirs. So there's just so many pieces I think that I never knew, and this was just really timely today to hear this conversation, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Can you say the name of the book again?
This fierce
Please.
people, it really devotes,
Fierce People.
yeah, the
Thank you.
how was fought in the South.
Yeah,
And I
definitely. I totally agree. As somebody who I said at the beginning, I'm not from Charlotte, I'm not from the South. I think I definitely had that kind of streamlined mental image of what happened during the revolution. So definitely for me, it's, books like that and the conversations like this have really opened my eyes up to kind of how complicated it was and how, even the people who we sort of did know a lot about, how when we look at their stories again, we can kind of, if we ask different questions, you can always learn something a little bit different. Um, Evan or Cassidy, do you want to respond to that at all?
I'm happy to add a little bit here. I'm not familiar with the book, so I apologize. I'll certainly see about adding it to my reading list. But one of the things I'd certainly like to, add on to that is that when we talk about the American Revolution, we talk about what the U.S. military is in the 18th and 19th century. It is very much sort of a sort of a developing institution. We have this picture of what the modern U.S. military is today. But certainly when the United States was being forged and creating sort of a military fighting force, it is reliant upon local militia companies, what become state militias, often organized at the county level. We look at sort of and remember the Continental Army led by George Washington, but it is often going to be even throughout the majority of the 19th century, these sort of local organizing groups of civic, leaders forming companies, deploying regiments, sort of feeding soldiers in to hopefully what is a broader coordinated war effort, whatever that conflict might be in the late 18th and then into the 19th century. But yeah, this sort of, top-down approach to how we sort of think about military hierarchy wasn't necessarily well entrenched in the United States really until probably get to the Mexican-American War and then to the American Civil War, where it becomes a bit more articulated and disciplined. When we look at the wars fought against indigenous peoples up through the first half of the 19th century, cities are providing soldiers with sort of the weapons and supplies that they need. Men are expected to be proficient with a weapon. They're expected to have a weapon, though many don't. So they're going to be reliant upon donations or counties or armories to basically supply the basic needs of these soldiers that are going to then enlist and volunteer in a war effort.
We have another question that was directed to me in the chat. Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate hearing and learning. What do you recommend as steps to write better history going forward? I heard to let the truth be spoken to balance the recording of history. Any suggestions?
I would suggest just talking to the people that are still here. Talk to the people and their experiences, and find the pieces that, where within certain small communities where they have things documented, or some way to connect with those people to let their story be heard. I think that's the only way to really, truly, accurately teach, is to let those people who you're teaching about have a voice.
Um, I'll say as the university professor is definitely make sure you're looking for books written by university professors, as at least modern ones are good go-to sources. But I'd say, encourage people to read widely. There are reasons why we have new books coming out on the American Revolution. It's not just because they're looking to capitalize on the 250th anniversary, but because hopefully some of these efforts are looking at wider perspectives. There's a pretty innovative book written a few years ago called West of the Revolution. Takes a really sort of inverted perspective on how we consider the start of the American Revolution, what's going on in a continental perspective, one that's not necessarily just looking at, the events of Boston, the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, and then the formation of the Continental Congress. That there are sort of a lot of different ways, sort of a lot of more sort of diverse perspectives in modern scholarship, looking at U.S. history. So I'd certainly encourage people to do those types of readings when they're looking. And then certainly, if you want to get down to sort of the more sort of focused levels, groups like the Catawba Nation certainly have information to share about their perspectives on the American Revolution, and many other indigenous groups across Eastern North America likewise are interested in sharing and sort of inserting where they fit into and how they have influenced these historic events.
Yeah, that's something definitely that I always encourage too. Don't rely just on one source. There's always so many different sources. You look at your old, look at your new, and the common themes that you find within them, that usually is the truth. They're not all written. That's not all the truth in one situation. Like you said, you have to explore the many other sources that are out there.
Yes, yes. The historians, all of us are smiling. Yes, multiple sources, good sources. These are important things. You got to make sure that you are um asking about things from lots of different angles, certainly. We do have one more question, I think, in the chat. This one, I think either one of y'all might be able to answer. Without a shared language, how did the Catawbas know about the treaties, or that the treaties that they, how did they know that the treaties would be honored? Basically, can either of y'all say a little bit about, it sounds like just communication between Catawba and English settlers?
Well, at that point where the 1700s is, there was some Catawba here that spoke English. There was a lot of Catawba that actually, and other indigenous communities that spoke English, because, our first contact with European people was not the 1700s. It was the 1540s in this area. So since then, I'm sure people stay behind. There's traders. You spoke on that map that you mentioned earlier. That's in the collection at the UNC Chapel Hill in their archives there. We used a copy of it, and that was actually done by a tradesman. And he was a fur tradesman that was trying to convince the people in Charleston to come trade with our bigger Nassau village. You don't see Catawba reference. It's because Catawba Nation wasn't Catawba Nation until the 1700s. We named ourselves based on our villages, and then as a collective came together and formed what was the Catawba Confederation. And so, there was English spoken even at this point. That was one of my questions I had at first contact. We have our story of the interaction with the Lady of Kofetacheke. At that point, there was still people there that would have been able to communicate with DeSoto. And that was because, 1540, yeah, was the first documented really encounter, but through these conversations, you has to be there was other people there that could help translate, could help, you know, um, be the interpreter for speaking and communicating. So there was that there, and that's one of the big miscommunications I think in indigenous country as well, that we weren't able to communicate with the people, but we were, because we learned the languages of those around us.
I'll add that
Thank you.
that is definitely the case across Eastern North America and across North America at large. To put this in maybe sort of a familiar perspective, when the Pilgrims arrived in what becomes the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there is an English-speaking Wampanoag Indian. We're going to see this interaction happen in the early 1600s, but there are going to be English ships, Spanish ships, French explorers moving into the American interior. They are going to be interacting with one another. They are going to be trying to decipher each other's languages. We're going to see in certain instances that will be advantageous to people like DeSoto, that former shipwreck survivors are going to basically traverse the coastline of the Gulf Coast and become at least somewhat proficient in various indigenous languages. So we certainly have this historical perspective of separate peoples going back to going back to the 1500s and the 1600s and even into the 1700s. But these are very interconnected peoples, especially by the 18th century. By the time of the American Revolution, there's at least a century of intercultural and economic exchange between colonists of English descent and then indigenous peoples in the area. And if you go back to Spanish incursions in the area, as Kassidy said, you have the Spanish explorers, Spanish conquistadors moving into the American interior, beginning throughout the first half of the 16th century.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a perfect place, honestly, to end it because I think it emphasizes that history and the histories of every single continent on this earth are much more diverse than I think a lot of people realize. I think that there are a lot more stories here. For me, it kind of blew my mind in a way to think about how I mean, the first European settlers here spoke Spanish. Right. So when we think about Charlotte is like kind of now there's a lot of Hispanic people moving to Charlotte, like that people have been saying that for literally 500 years, and so, I'm being a little bit facetious there, but I think it's something important to keep in mind when we think about who has been around here, and how there's a lot more than just those 250 years of neat history that I think a lot of us maybe learned in our high school textbooks. So, thank you again to Evan. Thank you to Cassidy. Thank you to Kendall as well. Kendall, I'll hand it back over to you if you want to say anything to close us out. And then everybody can enjoy their Saturdays.
Yeah, just thank you again to everybody for coming. Um, yeah, if you want to watch it again, it'll be on our YouTube channel. So Charlotte Museum of History on YouTube. Go watch it. I'll probably upload it on, let's be honest, Tuesday. But yeah, enjoy your Saturday. And if you have any questions, feel free to stick around. I'll hang out for a little bit.
Right. Thank you all for having me, and feel free to visit the Catawba Cultural Center on the Catawba Indian Reservation in Cinder Rock Hill, South Carolina. It's a free museum to come and learn and interact. Um, and we have a shop there, nature trails, kind of immerse yourself in the history we do have.
I'd also like to add, thank you for having me as well. And if you first enjoy the Catawba Nation Cultural Center, you can come over to the USC Lancaster Native American Studies Center, where we have an open facility as well with museum exhibits, speakers, an archaeology lab. Fantastic place to visit. We'd love to see you.
Thanks. And on that YouTube link, we will put links to both of those institutions as well.